again for the second round of the ground check discussions organized by the German Archaeological Institute. Last week, we looked at the data. How can we know about past climate and the societies who had to deal with it? Today, we want to go really down to earth and look at the prehistoric and historic climate challenges and the solutions people found in discussion number 2. Impact of climate change on early cultures, case studies. And in the space of this session, we will cover Anatolia, Morocco, Central and East Asia, and West Africa. And the time span will reach from the beginning of the Holocene up to almost 500 years ago. And again, we will start off with 4 short presentations. Then there will be a discussion among the speakers. And finally, all of you can ask your questions, either using the chat function within Zoom or asking on Facebook or Twitter. And you can type off your questions right away. They will be stored and we will come back to them. But first, let me introduce today's speakers. We have the prehistoric archaeologist, Dr. Clare. He's a lecturer at the Istanbul Department of the German Archaeological Institute. Then there's Dr. Jörg Linstädter. He's a prehistoric archaeologist as well. He's a scientific director at the German Archaeological Institute in Bonn, and he's a coordinator of several programs like Entangled Africa and the Trans-Area Network Africa. Then there's archaeologist Dr. Mayke Wagner. She's scientific director at the Eurasia Department and head of the Beijing branch of the German Archaeological Institute. And finally, archaeologist Dr. Andrea K. She's based at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, and she's a specialist in geoinformation systems. Welcome to all of you. We will now look at the case studies in chronological order, and we start at the beginning of the Holocene. After the cold spell of the Younger Dryas, conditions got slowly favorable again. How did the people in Anatolia react to these new opportunities, Clare?
The new opportunities, I mean, were they new opportunities, in fact? I mean, the question is, I think there were more challenges coming along for these communities at this time. And I think that's what I'm going to be looking at today in this sort of short presentation. Now, what we can see here is a site that I'm very familiar with. This is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a reconstruction showing it at around 8,600 BC. And I'm going to be talking now about roughly the climate change during this long process of neolithization in this region. Now, I'm a bit distracted because I've got faces all over my screen. Okay. So we saw this last time. Detlef Born showed this map last time showing the dispersal of the Neolithic from more or less the Fertile Crescent down here, which you can see. And he was talking about the linear pottery culture up here in Central Europe. Of course, for me, or my area of study is going to be down here, more or less where it all started. And that's in Upper Mesopotamia. Now, I think we need to stress here, the Neolithic, so-called Neolithic Revolution wasn't actually a revolution in sort of it wasn't fast, okay? It wasn't a revolution. A revolution implies something that happens quite quickly. But this was a process that happened over many millennia. In fact, the different packages or the different elements of the Neolithic way of life came at quite different times over these several millennia. In fact, sedentism, so living in one spot, came in quite early. In fact, as early as the late Pleistocene in the Epipaleolithic. Here we have an example from the Levant from Ohalo II. And then, for example, around the mid-9th millennium, we have crops, domesticated plants and animals coming in. And it wasn't until 7000 BC that we have pottery coming in, at least in Upper Mesopotamia. So what we now see here is this sort of what we refer to, this is the terminology that we use. So we have the Epipaleolithic, then we have the early Holocene coming in with the pre-pottery Neolithic A. So the pre-pottery Neolithic, obviously before pottery, which comes in here, PPNB, and of course the pottery Neolithic. I'll come back to these graphs here at the top in a second, to these climate charts. Let's just proceed first of all to the region of study, that's Upper Mesopotamia. I think most people know or are aware of where that lies. We're in the sort of border region between Turkey, Syria, northern Iraq, and over here Iran. In the north, we have the boundary of the Eastern Taurus Mountains, and important for this study is obviously the Haran Plain where Göbekli Tepe lies, but also the Tigris region here is also very important, as we will see during this period. Now, modern day climate conditions there, it's semi-arid, so we have 600 to 300 millimeters of rain per year, and to the south that sort of borders on the 300 to 200 millimeters per year, which is roughly at the edge, or what's dry agriculture has problems then down in this area. So if we come to the climate proxies, I'm going to keep this very brief. It looks very complicated, but it's just 3 important climate proxies. For the Upper Mesopotamian region, we don't actually have reliable sort of local proxies which cover the whole of this sort of long time span. So actually I've taken a look at two important proxies for the Northern Hemisphere here. So we have at the bottom, this is quite important, this is the non-sea salt proxy from the Greenland ice. And actually what we can see here is this is a proxy for the Siberian high pressure. So if you know that in the winter, if we have a very severe winter, usually there's a very intense high pressure over Siberia, which is channeling the cold air down to us. And there are periods in these last 10,000 years after, you can see here the Younger Dryas, but also periods within the Holocene which have been impacted by these sort of very intense periods of high Siberian, intense high pressure over Siberia. One being here the famous sort of 10.2 kilo annum KBP event at 8,200 BC, and then one here, this is a longer period of sort of climate instability in the 7th century BC, so in the late Neolithic, and that's comparable to sort of a little ice age. In fact, the last sort of period of sort of anomalies in this curve does actually correspond to the last little ice age, so from the 15th to the 19th century AD. Then in the middle we have the Dead Sea. This is a more of a local proxy for Mesopotamia, in fact, because we're then in the Jordan Valley. We can see a sharp increase in the amount of precipitation and the seawater level in the Dead Sea around 8,200. So shortly after this event here in the Siberian high pressure event, and this is also known as the Levantine moist period, and this corresponds also to the period, at least in Mesopotamia, where we have the sort of first domesticated, morphologically domesticated species, animals and plants. And then at the top here, we have another core or another proxy from the Greenland ice. And this is showing air temperature over Greenland, but it's also a proxy then for the entire Northern Hemisphere. And you can see the cold weather here, the cold temperatures here during the Younger Dryas, but also here, the 8.2 event during the 7th millennium Little Ice Age. Anyway, that's enough of that, because that's quite enough of that. Back to the archaeology. Now what we have here are some calibrated radiocarbon dates, in fact, quite a few. About nearly 600 radiocarbon dates from 22 different sites in the Upper Euphrates region. And you can see here how they correspond to different periods in this chronology, in this sort of climate proxy chart. Now this is a bit difficult to show in this form. So let's go on, I've actually plotted these sites on maps so we can see what's going on in the landscape at different times. We start off at the Younger Dryas, and we can see here a few scattered sites along the Euphrates, for example. We have 1 or 2 possible sites here around Urfa, and we have a number of sites dotted around along the Tigris. Now, important is that these people were hunter-gatherers at this time. In fact, they remained hunter-gatherers right until, farming came in with the domesticated animals and crops around the mid-9th millennium BC. So they were living in small, sort of increasingly sedentary societies. We have sites such as Göbekli Tepe here, where we know they were not just hunting animals, but also they were using there was the resources from the river, from the Tigris, so they were fishing, but hunting in other parts, they were hunting gazelle and various things, and gathering wild crops and wild vegetables and wild plants. Moving on to the PPNA, more or less the same regarding subsistence, but you can see the increase in the number of sites here. So what happened, we have the amelioration, the climate amelioration, things improving, and the number of sites actually exploding both in the Tigris Basin over here and also here along the Euphrates. So it's clear that we have an increase in population at this time that goes hand in hand with this climate amelioration. Now, I think the most important thing to note now is the next sort of sequence. This is the early PPNB. What happens here? The whole of the Tigris Basin, apart from one site, is abandoned. And the sites along the Euphrates also seem to be abandoned as well, with the exception of one or two sites, there's Bonjuklu over here and Jade and Morebet over here, which sort of appear to be sort of central sites that didn't go out of use. But we see a large number of sites appearing in the Urfa region. Now, a lot of these are actually surface survey sites, but we know from the archaeology on the surface, especially from the tepelas found on the surface, that these are in fact early PPMB in date. So it seems that we have some sort of refuge here. I mean, I don't know whether this is actually a climate thing or whether it's actually something else. But it certainly appears that this area is abandoned. This is more or less abandoned, and we have this intensification of settlement in this area. We'll come back to this so-called late PPNA hunter crisis, as I've termed it, in a few moments. And we go on to the middle PPNB. Now these sites are more or less in decline now. Göbekli Tepe is going out of use, so I imagine that all these other Tepela sites are also going out of use at this time too. But we have a few central settlements that are still sort of running, are still being, people are still living there, and a few new ones over here. In fact, the biggest change would come in the next sort of map that I haven't got. With the late PPNB, we have settlements coming in here, also in the Balig Valley and in northern Syria. Now, I want to keep this quite short, so I want to go back to this late PPNA hunter crisis, where we have this abandonment of this area in the Tigris, in the Tigris Basin, and also here along the Euphrates. And we can see here, this demographic increase occurring here. And funnily enough, all of these sites, or most of them in fact, have shown remains of these large tepelas on the surface, so very much like Göbekli Tepe. So what is causing that? I don't know if it's climate, but there is a climate signal. It's very small here, I'm sorry, here. But this is a thing with sort of long-term. All the time, the climate is changing. We have this sort of climate amelioration taking place, but within that amelioration, there are certain events also coming in there, which can impact those societies. And these societies at this time, in my opinion, were at a very critical stage. I mean, they're going from hunter-gathering to they're gradually transitioning, as it were, into farmers. And that makes them, in my opinion, extremely vulnerable. Vulnerable not only biophysically, of course, you have the increase in the number of sites in the PPNA, and of course, there's strain on resources, but you also have initial sort of signs of social hierarchization, so perhaps richer burials, and you see, there are the haves and the have-nots for the first time. And of course, this leads to stress within the community itself. And they have to be able to mitigate that. So for some reason, I said we can't quite reconstruct it. We're seeing this demographic increase in this area around Urfa, and then the construction of monuments or buildings such as this at Göbekli Tepe. So we have these really monumental structures, buildings with these magnificent tepelas carved from the local limestone. We have, we know that these tepelas are actually depictions of the human form. So we have the belts, the loincloths, the hands on the stomach, etc. They are human depictions, perhaps depictions of ancestors. We have then these pictures carved onto them with different animals, not just animals they're seeing in the environment, but actually in sort of a narrative. So we're seeing, in my opinion, the narratives of these hunter-gatherers preserved, or they're trying to preserve this way of life in this refugium, let's call it. But as we know, this didn't last long, because by the end of the early PPNB, by around 8000 BC, these sites also fell into decline and these monumental buildings disappeared. And we don't have anything comparable until the Chalcolithic. So yeah, that's what I wanted to speak about briefly. I think we can go into more depth in the conversation in a few moments. It's a lot to sort of get into your head, and it's a lot of information. So yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions as well.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting talk. It really shows that that's not one revolution, but it's really a long process with a lot of times when things got worse again and didn't work out. So it was a process of a long time, not only in Anatolia, but these ideas which were generated there, the ideas and practices, they diffused or migrated to other regions, which took even more time. And the local people there were often as reluctant as the people in Anatolia to give up their own way of life. And it took some time until they really got convinced that this new style of agriculture is really worth giving a try, as Jörg Linstädter will show. But first, These interactions between the regions, they are key to the development. So do archaeologists have to look beyond their individual sites and focus more on the exchange of goods and ideas between them, Dr. Linstädter?
Yeah, hello. At first I would say reluctant. I don't know if it's the right term. It sounds a bit negative to me. I think that if hunter-gatherers live in a certain area for a certain period of time, I think they know their ecosystem very well, and they develop their methods for sustainable subsistence strategies, and so they take over innovations when they make sense, I think. And also another thing is that you need to have kind of social structure that fits to these innovations. In other words, it makes no sense if you have status symbols, if you have an egalitarian society, for instance. And sedentism needs a lot of structures which hunter-gatherers communities maybe not have. And so the second part of your question, if archaeologists need to look behind the sites, I think it happens very quickly because if you find something, you want to know what it is, where it comes from, how widespread it is, and so you immediately start looking at the results of your colleagues. And this is what I think is very important, and that's why we have at the German Institute several, let's say, platforms to exchange between scientists. And I would like to, before I come to my case study, I would like to present two of these, let's say, platforms. And one of them is the Trans-Area Network Africa. This is where all the DRE projects working in Africa exchange their ideas and results. And there are 5 departments involved in Africa research at the German Institute. And in order to better coordinate this work, TANA was founded in 2014. It enables communication among each other and with African partners. And for example, through workshops, and it also improves the visibility of our research, for instance, with the help of our homepage or booklets and others. And we develop training programs, for instance, massive open online courses where we work at the moment, and we jointly apply for third-party funded projects. And one, let's say, successful, one successful example for such an application is the priority program Entangled Africa, funded by the German Research Foundation. And here 12 projects are researching intra-African relations between rainforest and Mediterranean, between about 6,000 and 500 BP. The main hypothesis of the project or the program is that the less researched intra-African relationships had a much more greater impact on the cultural development in North Africa than previously assumed. Therefore, long-distance contacts are studied, especially between the better researched cultural centers in Northern Africa and their periphery. And at the left-hand side, you see Michelle Diniez. She's also a member of the program, and she presented her results 2 weeks ago in the last ground check series. And not to forget, of course, the ground check program with 19 projects on 4 continents. Many of them are presented here in this series. And now I come to my case study, and I also likely start with this graph from Detlef Gronborn he showed 2 weeks ago, and it's just a nice reminder. You see the red frame at the left-hand side. This is where my case study is placed. And so just to remember, the most important animals and plant species were domesticated in Western Asia or the so-called Near East. And until the middle of the 8th millennium BP, knowledge about food production spread to the West Mediterranean. Up to now, we don't have any ADNA studies for this region. However, archaeological data on the production of jewelry or stone and bone tools indicate a continuity of local hunter-gatherer societies. And they came into contact with early farming communities and adopt their technologies, but step by step, as you have mentioned. This concerns only domesticated animals and plants and pottery. We know nothing about village-like settlements as in the Eastern Mediterranean, as Lee has shown. The region is semi-arid and was semi-arid also during the Middle Holocene, and thus more vulnerable to climate and environmental changes. And indeed, in some cases, it is possible to identify links between climate events and changes in settlement patterns. So in the case of Ifli and Seda, a shelter in the Rift Mountains, we see that climate events correlate with interruptions here of the settlement or the settlement process. And you see, for instance, the famous 8.2 event Clare has just mentioned and explained. And but the question is how these, and here also at the bottom, the blue proxy is the non-sea salt proxy, which indicates the cold winter events from Siberia. He has also shown some minutes ago. So you have a bit of a connection between the East and West Mediterranean. So we work with the same climate proxies, and then we can see if these climate proxies correlate also with the settlement history or the occupation in our research areas. And as you can see here, there are lots of correlation between these proxies and the occupation history of this shelter, for instance. And the question is how these correlations between occupation and climate data correlate with diet. And so the question arises if the beginning of food productions in the area or the composition of food, of diet, is somehow connected with climate and environmental changes. And I mean, there's no lecture about climate change without these complex graphs, but I will explain it a little bit. So at the top, you see the radiocarbon data, the summed probability distributions, and at the bottom, several climate data sets. And as you can see here, where the green bar is, this is the moment of when first time food production appears in the Western Mediterranean. We can't see any correlation with, or few correlation with climate change data. So food production is probably not correlated with any climate change. It has other reasons which needs to be studied in the future. This is different, for example, with the end of the early Neolithic or the Neolithic in general. You see the red bars, which are correlated with climate data that show an increased aridity in the area. And concerning the composition of the diet, we can see two different developments. First of all, the composition of food varies extremely between different sites, and responsible for this is the adaptation to local factors. And on the other hand, we rarely see food production being adopted 100% immediately. Ifri Udaden, as you can see here, is an example of a site at the Rift Coast, and it shows that domesticated species make up no more than 10% of the diet. Hunting, gathering, and fishing still plays a significant role, especially the use of mollusks, terrestrial, but also marine mollusks. And all this, as we understand it, helps to reduce the risk of climate and environmental changes. And with my last slide, I would like to build a bridge to the present. Rising temperatures and irregular precipitation today require an adaptation, especially of crops, and a high degree of diversity is needed here. Diversity, maybe as I have shown in the case of the Middle Holocene. And the FAO has pointed out this. Food security is one of the most important goals of the FAO. And however, it is recognized that monocultures are far too vulnerable and don't have the necessary flexibility. And therefore, the topic of food security becomes more and more associated with diversity, and thus the indigenous knowledge and language. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Linstädter. So we see again that the adaptation to climate change is not only about reacting to climate, but to reacting to the social circumstances of the society and the people as well. So we looked at the Fertile Crescent, we looked at the north of Africa. Now we move eastward and look how people dealt there with climate change. Mayke Wagner will take us to the Bronze Age in the Tarim Basin. There, people used to live in large settlements, keeping big herds. And as the region got drier, this was no longer sustainable. So how did people there adapt to the new situation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Wildermuth, dear friends and colleagues. So East Asia seems to be far away, particularly now in our current times, but in fact is very close in our everyday life. So West Asian domesticated cereals domesticated in West Asia, such as wheat, and cereals domesticated in East Asia, such as millet and rice, were spread across Eurasia and became basic to human nutrition. Trade networks like the Silk Road connect people and regions, at least for the last 2,000 years. So the change of climate and environments impacted the human societies, while humans transformed their landscapes. That is widely accepted. That's why we are here discussing it. Our research questions in East Asia are, in which way and how fast did this happen? For today's discussion, I have chosen sites where we checked the ground. One of them is Liushi site in the Kunlun Mountains at the southern rim of the Tarim Basin in western China. Liushi was a burial place from 1100 to 500 years BCE. During the funeral ceremony, the bereaved placed stone mounds or circles above the burial pits as marks on the surface, as you can see here. The grave goods reveal features not seen before 1100 BC in the Tarim region, but from that time on became typical in the Tian Shan and Kunlun mountain ranges. Specific types of bronze weaponry, horse gear, and bones of horse and sheep or goat. They are characteristic for mounted pastoralists as part of a new and flexible subsistence strategy. Farming on a smaller scale than before, animal husbandry on a bigger scale, mainly sheep, goat, and horse, wider territory of action, people could move faster and further. Together with horseback riding and fighting, a new lower body garment was invented, the trousers, as part of the riding equipment. The new flexible economy with mounted pastoralism spread in western and northern China during the first millennium BCE. The inhabitants of the steppe zone were numerous and powerful enough to impact the Chinese kingdom Zhou, and even forced the royal court to relocate its capital from modern Xi'an in the west to Luoyang in the east, and that's why becoming the Eastern Zhou dynasty. Situation changed when the northern Chinese empires adopted cavalry as a form of combat, which led to a growing demand of horses and pastures, of course. From now on, pastures were fought over like the oil fields today. This extensive use of pasture land coincides with the climate change pavetas of Shotas in our first ground check discussion last week. The drying trend and transformation of the forest steppe into steppe. But that was a climate archive from the Beijing region, which means from the east, which receives more rainfall than the Tarim region. Life in Tarim Basin is much more vulnerable and depends on the meltwater runoff from the surrounding mountains. But when the glaciers shrank, the rivers dried up and riparian oases suffered from lack of water. Life was only possible at the foot of the mountains and on the high mountain pastures. Liushi is one example of this move towards the mountains, out of the basin, out of the valleys. The drying trend continued for another millennium, and we know how it ended. Understanding the mechanism, the tipping points, and particularly the timing of action and reaction is fundamental. We inherited the inventions of the people 3,000 years ago, the acceleration of our bodies through horsepower, and the reinforcement of our bodies for the new mobility with pants. Not last and not least, we also, as we see today, inherited the challenge of coping with climate change. So this was in short what we can learn from the steps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this report from the steps, and that I finally know where my trousers are coming from. So these were all case studies which dig deep at limited places, but there's another way of approaching this, and this is trying to link the different individual data points in a way and get information over a broader region. Modern geoinformation systems give a new possibility to really organize information and try to extract patterns over these broad regions, over broad time spans. Andrea K, she focuses on West Africa. We've seen that the local people develop very different strategies. So is there a common developmental trajectory for the whole region of West Africa?
In some ways that there is, but then also in some ways it's not necessarily a trajectory, but a sort of different series of events. So West Africa makes a very interesting case study in why it's very important to study the different types of land use that people are using and their relationship to the environment. And that is because there are cyclical relationships between climate changes and environment or land cover that also then feed back into the climate or the weather. And those environments also affect what types of land uses can occur in those places. And those land uses in turn affect the environment and the land cover. And then of course, the next rung is land use has a cyclical relationship with the population of the people that are practicing it. And so in order to really understand the relation of the climate at the top and the environment with population, the people and the culture at the bottom, you have to understand the environment and the land use that come in between in those cyclical relationships. And land use can mean a lot of different things, and different types of land use have much different effects on the local landscape and feedbacks to the climate, and also different lengths of time that those effects permeate in the landscape. So very intensive land uses, such as farming, open fields, mining and metallurgy, and villages have a much longer lasting taphonomic effect on the environment than lower impact land uses like hunting and gathering, but they all do still have their individual impacts. And the basic principle of this as well is that the more intensively you use the land, the more people you can support on the same amount of land. So these are circle diagrams that are examples of sort of two extremes of what you might find in Africa. The one that is mostly green with one little red dot in the middle, that is the representative land use of a small band of Kung hunter-gatherers from the Kalahari. And to get enough calories from the landscape in that climate zone using those techniques, that is the amount of land you would need to feed 10 people in 1 year. And you take the same physical amount of land and you put it in a humid tropical environment with intensive agriculture and agroforestry, and then you can support 4,000 people on the same amount of land. And that's an example from something like one of the garden cities of a low density urbanism that you might find in West Africa. And there's a whole range of things in between that I've been looking at for the West and Central African region. And part of the reason I've been looking at it is because there's been a debate about not only effects of climate on society, but on society's effect on climate in that region. First, you have the Sahara region, which during the African humid period was more like a Sahelian or Sudanian environment. And then after the African humid period ended, you got a climate much more like what we see today, where the Sahara is, hyper arid. And while people do still live in parts of the Sahara, they're not widespread, and it's small occupations that are limited to water sources. And both the end of the African humid period and later on what is called a forest crisis in parts of Central and West Africa have been said to be either due solely to climate change or aided by humans. And so that's part of what I want to address today. One of the trajectories that you might see in West Africa is the spread of food production throughout that period. So at the top maps, starting at 1800 BC, you see the beginnings of food production in that region, and this coincides with when the African humid period starts to end. And these are fairly detailed maps, and I don't have time to get into a lot of them in great detail, but the two things you should notice are the bright yellow, which is small-scale food production, and this is very similar to what Dr. Linstädter was just talking about, where people are still mainly relying on wild hunting, gathering, fishing resources, but integrating a small percentage of their diet with farmed crops and domestic animals. And they're also highly mobile. So they're not really staying in the same place all the time. They're moving around on the landscape. And this is the way that food production first comes to this part of Africa. And it starts slow at first and then starts to spread. And by 600 BC is spread all across the sort of Sudanian zone. And then as you go through the maps, as you go forward in time, the colors start to get darker. And those are different types of land use, different types of agriculture, incorporating more diversified crop sets, more intensive methods, more diverse methods. And it's important to track these changes so that we can compare them with the climate archives that have been previously published and also heavily criticized. So, for example, this graph that came out in 2012, this was from an ocean core that was showing there was a period of time, which is highlighted in green, where you see a weathering event, is what it was called. And the authors of this paper attributed this increased weathering not with a change in climate or precipitation, but instead with increased human land use because of the Iron Age occupations in the region. And this was widely criticized because they didn't provide any evidence of archaeological occupations that would be large enough to sort of justify this amount of change. And because the people living in the area at that time were either hunter-gatherers or these sort of small-scale food producers, and people thought, that it wouldn't have had enough of an impact on the landscape to make this kind of difference in the chemical weathering and rock weathering that you see. More recently, people have looked at this in more detail, and this is a core from a lake called Borombi in Cameroon, and it's a much smaller watershed than you would get from that oceanic core. And so it can tell you very specifically what's happening in this very small watershed. And also they've put it up next to the insolation curve. And so as you can see, the insolation curve, which is the angle of the Earth to the sun through time, which should have large climatic effects, the precipitation and temperature track that insolation curve very nicely, and the vegetation doesn't at all. So we're seeing at a point that the vegetation goes from mature, undisturbed rainforest, and then you see a spike, that spot that's highlighted in yellow that represents the forest crisis, because it all of a sudden becomes degraded or secondary forests, and it also includes higher amount of grasses, which was also included in the last graph. And so, well, what could cause this very extreme sort of decoupling of the vegetation with the overall climate signature? And it just so happens that humans could have caused that. And because this is the time slice of map that corresponds with the beginning of that spike in the vegetation. And Birambiambo is right there. And so that spike perfectly coincides with when small scale food production reaches that part of Africa. And while the late Holocene rainforest crisis has been documented in different parts of Africa at slightly different times, it does generally correlate with when humans arrive in this sort of like first wave of small scale food production. And the reason for that is because even though in 1 year you would not need a lot of land area to support one settlement, say, those settlements were mobile, and the people practicing this type of agriculture would move around from year to year. And when you're in a grassland environment, that doesn't make much of a difference because grass will grow back by the next year. But if you're working in a mature forest environment and you cut down those trees, it can take 100 to 200 years to regain the vegetation structure of a mature rainforest. So they could have had a very serious effect in a very short amount of time. And then subsequently, it would take a very long time for that landscape to recover to what it was before. And so there's just an example of that for West Africa and Central Africa, where you would see occupations moving around. And in the grassland environment, you know, after a few years, you could hardly tell that they had been there because the grass would grow back and the animals could return. But in the forest environment, that's just a much longer fix. And all of these changes to the forest environment can also produce these feedback effects because it'll change the albedo and the evapotranspiration of the region. And so it can also change the climate of that area. So this farming adaptation that starts in the Sahara and sort of gradually spreads through West Africa into Central Africa over the course of a few thousand years, something that starts there can affect the rainforest thousands of kilometers away.
Humans are not only at the mercy of climate, but in a way they're producing part of the climate even back in these long ago times. So thank you for all these presentations. We will now dig deeper into several aspects of this in the panel discussion. Please feel free and start to send questions via Zoom chat or Facebook or Twitter. We will come back to them later. There's already one question pending. But before we go to the questions, I would like to ask all of you, one of the themes that connect the different sides and different stories is that people are very flexible and very innovative. So it's not like the climate is doing something and people react in a deterministic way. So this is a wrong picture we have from early societies, that they are at the mercy, and we have to look more at them as very active and very innovative harbingers of change themselves. Yeah, Dr. Clare?
Okay, well, you know, looking at the long-term development, I mean, from my areas that I've looked at in Turkey, both for the Upper Mesopotamian early Neolithic, but also for the Central Anatolian sort of late Neolithic, for the later rapid climate change interval. I mean, I would say that really, I think this adaptation or these changes that were going on were not conscious. I don't think, you know, we're looking at, especially in the case of Upper Mesopotamia, we're looking at several millennia, several thousand years. And I very much doubt that there was any sort of, I don't know, conscious decision to adapt in a way to something that they couldn't quite grasp. And the climate was something that was changing largely. And I don't think, unless there was a really abrupt event for many years, in fact, I don't think they would make any conscious decision to change anything they were doing abruptly, because these were sort of life ways they've been living for many, many millennia, in fact, and just to change everything, you know, click the switch, you can't do. So I think, you know, with regard to the long duration of climate change, I think we have to sort of, you know, compare to today's climate change. We know we have it in the media, we know it's abrupt, it's happening quickly, things are happening, but for them, it was a totally different matter. And I think this is something that we need to discuss also with regard to today's climate change, because I think, you know, this general sort of trend, we're adapting the whole time without even noticing it.
Are these changes in the steppe where people started to move on horseback, were these more rapid developments, or did they play out over these long time spans as well, Dr. Wagner?
If I may, I would like to show one more picture because it's related to the development of the Silk Road. And there the periods are actually much shorter. Yeah, you see, we had a chance to reconstruct climate and precipitation based on tree rings, and there you get an annual resolution. That means the data are much more precise. So the annual rainfall, how much rain did fall every year, and based on these trees, still analyzed by Dr. Uwe Heusner, who's not with us anymore in the Institute, but was a long time working with us in China, we could analyze tree rings from the northeastern corner of the Tibetan Plateau. And what we found, just show you briefly here, the longest dry period in the Chinese history. So it started about, as you see, start of Common Era here, 0, and lasted almost 300 years, let's say about. So this is not much time. So let's say 100 years are, let's say, maybe 3 to 4 human generations. So this is time which can be remembered. And the Silk Roads, they developed exactly here in the beginning of that dry period and ended short before this dry period ended because everything fell dry. So the precipitation amount was below the modern level. So this is something which the people had to react in generations of time, 2 to 3 generations. So maybe what we can see here in the long term, that changes were speeding up, and something which people certainly experienced during their lifetime, or at least could remember from parents and grandparents when you're coming closer to modern periods. And if you have the chance to get a higher resolution in the data, I think this is also related. You see, if you have data which can be understood in annual steps, then you see sometimes at some points the story developing faster and people reacting certainly more clearly, giving up of sites of the big desert sites, which are the oases connecting the Silk Roads. They were given up after 50 years of use. So that's a very short period. So people certainly experienced and reacted consciously, I think, here in this part.
How does it look in the North Africa region? There you said that the picking up the first steps in direction of agriculture were not in any way related to climate change, but later on there were these connections. So how close is a connection in your region, Dr. Linstädter, between climate and how people use different ways of living?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship is really close. The more arid a region is, the more vulnerable to climate change. And the less precipitation is, the more unstable, let's say. And we have a region with 300 millimeter precipitation per year, so that's not much. And so, of course, it's climate changes, let's say, affect such a region much faster than other regions, like more temperate regions. But as Clare has pointed out, there is no general answer to climate change because every climate change is different. There's temperature, there's precipitation, there are lots of things that could change. And one of the main questions is the speed, or how fast these climate changes happen. So if people have time to react or not. And this is also related to what Andrea Key has pointed out, that there is always a reaction of the landscape to climate changes. So it depends very much, the climate event, how it affects the region depends very much on the local topography, and if you have other kind of water resources, for instance, if the precipitation decreases. So it's really complex, and you have to study each event by its own. Of course, you can compare it with each other, but you have to look at your data. You can use the global data, as Lee and I have shown, but you need the terrestrial data of your region just to see how these global events affected your study area. And in North Africa, so the beginning of food production probably doesn't start with a climate event. It's just the cultural development. We see that the Neolithic innovations, they spread from east to west. So, and until Spain, we know that there are people also involved. So there are people migrating, because in northern Spain, we have ADNA studies that people from the Near East came and introduced these innovations. But from our study area, we have not. But we have, on the other hand, data that there is a continuity of people who somehow interacted with the first farmers and took over these step by step. So the invention of food production is more connected to these migration in the Mediterranean and social effects between hunter-gatherers and farming communities, which is more stronger in this moment than any climate events. But then later we see that the occupation ends, or there are occupation gaps, and these are clearly somehow related to climate, rapid climate events, these RCCs Lee has shown. And we don't know exactly what happened. We just see that a certain time period with a particular pottery style or subsistence strategy ends, and other people came in, and how these happened. So it's really difficult to reconstruct, and it will take some time.
Dr. Kay, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just was thinking that there's two very interesting examples of that in West and Central Africa, actually, that there's also a society called the Kintampo, who are some of the earlier to adopt farming. And then at some point, the Kintampo culture essentially disappears. You don't get those sites anymore, and you also don't get farming in that area anymore. So they essentially adopt farming and then abandon it. And in that region, you have only hunter-gathering again for several generations before more Iron Age farmers come in. And then also in Central Africa, the sort of leading edge of this small-scale food production that enters the forest, it has this really strong effect. And then you get an abandonment of a lot of those sites. And the next occupation by farmers in those areas tends to be more forest adapted, relying more heavily on arboriculture rather than savanna crops. They do still have some, but it doesn't seem to be as much. And these more intensive occupations that have the more diverse and more properly climate adapted crops seem to last longer, seem to be more sustainable. And so I think, in one way, the sort of adaptation of farming does, happen slowly over a long period of time. But I think once people are farming, that it is capable, it's possible within a generation or two to say, something's not working, let's change this. And they seem to be able to adapt to new environments and new conditions.
Does this chime in with your concept of vulnerability of societies, Dr. Clare, that it's not only about the environment, but the social constraints of a society within its environment that might let a society bloom or vanish?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, there's one point I wanted to pick up on that Jörg just mentioned, and I think to sort of state quite clearly, I think we're all of the opinion that causality of certain climate events doesn't actually mean that people reacted to it. And we also have the problem, of course, that we have the proxies that are available to us. I mean, we have to be very critical with these as well, also with our own archaeological data regarding dating of these events. Because of course, we're relying, we're seeing the contemporaneity of climate data and also archaeological data. But at the end of the day, we don't have that, sometimes the climate proxies are not as well dated, the archaeology is not so well dated, and it's very much interpolated. And we have to be very careful about aligning things up between climate and cultural development or changes in material culture. I think the second thing you're getting at here was the vulnerability. I mean, vulnerability, of course, is we differentiate between a sort of a biophysical vulnerability and a social vulnerability. That's done quite often now in modern sort of studies looking at climate impact on human culture and human communities. And of course, I think that's very important also for our periods in prehistory and more recent times. I mean, of course, we have the biophysical vulnerability would be literally the resources are no longer there. The climate change has led to certain foodstuffs being, disappearing. And of course, we have the social vulnerability, which is actually, and this is what I was getting at in my paper, that we have at this time in Mesopotamia, we have this sort of incipient hierarchy, social hierarchization of communities that we haven't actually seen before. There's a lot of debate whether they're still egalitarian hunter-gatherers or whether they're not quite that, but going, towards hierarchization. And I would argue that, yeah, we're seeing a certain degree of hierarchization there. And of course, that does lead to social imbalances. So of course, like I said, you have the groups that have more and have access to those limited resources and those that don't. And of course, then you have the vulnerable parts of society, which do have problems when abrupt climate change or bad winters do come in. So I think, yes, we have to look at vulnerability of prehistoric societies, not just biophysically, but also socially.
So do you see vulnerabilities of the societies you look at, Dr. K, that you said some of the early farmers were not as diverse in their food production. So did they have to get a more advanced set before they really could settle their long term?
Yeah, I think what you see initially is the small scale food producers doing fairly well, and you see some sort of like population growth. But then because the Sahara has become so arid at that point, there's sort of like a hard limit on how far north those populations can expand, and so everyone starts sort of expanding to the south and spreading out across the Sahel and sort of savanna zone. So I think that in that case, the resilience of that strategy is in its mobility, in its ability to move to different places, but then it becomes vulnerable again once it enters these forest environments that don't recover as quickly. And so then they develop new strategies that are more suited to those places that are more resilient to that environment.
So mobility was a big topic in Asia as well, in dealing with the drier climate, to move out of the plains into the mountains and then being able to move fast on horseback. So is this a solution to climate change, mobility?
Who can say? Certainly, this is the logic and first step. If a place is not welcoming humans anymore, not providing food, of course, people try to leave. What else they should do? So this seems to be easy, but I don't think it's so easy. And also there are many different solutions. So we need to take a closer look. And I completely agree with Lee. This is not always the case that we have high resolution data to say that, you see, what was first. And only that's why we need to, I cannot repeat this often enough, we need to check the ground point by point and check the archives and the proxies and really make them fit. So to answer this question, was the mobility really forced or was mobility first? So as you see the step, as I showed, it can also be the case, is we have these two different trends of drying and let's say an increase in population pressure here. So that means what was first, so it went hand in hand or step by step together. So they influenced each other definitely. So more people and drying trends in general, naturally drying trends. So what really caused this? What was the result of this entangled development? So this can certainly be answered in different ways and need to be checked in different parts in different areas. And that makes the story so interesting to see how many different solutions there were. Only one of this is mobility. I'm quite sure that people always prefer to stay where they are born. Home is home, always. It always was in the past, I think. So leaving is maybe not the first choice.
Do archaeologists have a too rosy view of the reactions to climate change, because mostly you look at the sites where people succeeded in dealing with climate change in a way?
I think the opposite is true, because as you have seen in our graphs, so we see how people fail. Maybe in contrast to recent research about agriculture or ethnography, whatever, where you maybe see the surviving cultures or surviving groups or surviving strategies. We see how civilizations end, how areas become depopulated or abandoned, as Lee has shown for the Near East. So we can, sometimes we can see what doesn't work. But it's very difficult just to work out exactly how people lived and then to see why they could not cope with these changing situations. But so we have no rosy view. It's just, we see very often that, that people just disappear and we don't know exactly why in many cases.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, that we get to see sort of what was there and then what continued beyond that point. So we aren't studying only the things that succeeded, but we also know what failed.
Well, archaeologists definitely have the long view, since we have to deal with climate change ourselves now. We seem to react only from year to year. So what can archaeologists as expert of the long view bring to the table today in our dealing with climate change?
I mean, maybe I can just connect with the last slide I have shown. So what I know from my research is that a huge variety of resources is really important if you want to cope with the changing framework conditions or changing conditions. And so I think sometimes it's easier to expand in a new area. It's one fact it's very interesting to me that when the first when agriculture, let's say cultivation, started in the Maghreb, in my study area, the people they use wheat and barley in the same relationship, and they tried then different species, how does it work? And then towards later periods, you can see that the relationship changes. So they just let's say throw on the fields whatever they have, and then you can have a look what works. And as I said, you can just slowly check the area, how does it work, and which plants grow, which not. And so to have these opportunities, this variety of tools and resources that helps you very much to cope with the situation, to expand in new areas, but also to survive during changes. So that's why what I would recommend is really to focus on this variety on resources and not focus on monocultures, and that we have an opportunity to choose depending on in which direction climate and environmental changes move nowadays. So this is what we maybe can learn from the past.
I mean, if I can add to that, I mean, I think I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I don't think this is going to happen, but I would say let's flatten the curve of social vulnerability. Let's make sure that everyone has access to education, everyone has access to the things that they need to survive, in a good way. But I don't think that's going to happen, so I'm a little bit pessimistic there.
Dr. Wagner, what do you think about the...
Of course, after that sentence, I need to be optimistic. It's clear. And of course, I certainly am, because we see, for instance, the last years I studied clothes of the people 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. And one of the biggest surprises in studying the dresses, the people, they are not only functional, and people have been extremely innovative in let's say, fitting a second body to the anatomical body of us. So not only a second skin like the dress usually is, but it's a body in which you can move freely. So they invented a lot of things just to make us comfortable in dresses. But they were also very creative and make it beautiful. So appealing. It's not only the function, but it's also the picture which they have from each other to cheer up and to be, let's say, colorful and not sometimes practical issues are not the first. So that makes me very, very optimistic that people always are searching for a good solution and a very pragmatic solution. If you can do it easy, don't make it complicated. So they find always an easy solution for technical problems and keep the beauty of life and make it even more beautiful. I think this is quite optimistic what we can learn from the past.
Okay, so thank you to the panel for all your input. Or do you want to add, Dr. Kay? Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that the study area in West Africa is a place where several different crops were domesticated. And those crops are not commonly grown there today because of the events of the colonial period. People have largely turned to New World crops, and especially corn, maize. And one of the sort of ongoing initiatives in that region of the world is to try and get people to go back to traditional crops because they're specifically adapted to those environments and also have quite good nutritional values and require less water. And so I think that that's sort of a direct effect of the archaeological research that we've been doing that can sort of confirm that those are more stable over a long term. And as Dr. Linstädter said, the diversity bed hedging, because that makes you more adaptable and resilient to short-term fluctuations.
So then thanks again for the panel for this lively discussion and input. Now I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions. You can use Zoom, you can use Facebook or Twitter. We have one question, which is a question which is addressed to Dr. Clare and Zine, I can't say the rest of the name. He or she asks, interesting presentation. Could you please repeat what kind of climate data was used in this work? The plot was based on measurements of the Dead Sea. How is it possible to reach to the climate data in ancient times? So he or she is interested in how you really know about the climate in your region.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps something I should point out. I mean, I'm a prehistoric archaeologist. I'm not a paleoclimatologist, not a natural scientist. So a lot of this stuff I've had to read in, myself and acquaint myself with it. Of course, I've had a lot of support in the last years. From many specialists in this area. But of course, yeah, I mean, the most important proxies, well, for the study in question, I was using the Dead Sea and I was using Greenland proxies from Greenland ice core. But of course, there are many more different proxies that can be used for looking at climate. Of course, we have the ice cores, there are the lake cores, for example. We heard about the tree rings and sea cores. Yeah, I mean, and of course, within these cores, there are then things like pollen caught in there or isotopes that can be measured. And these are then proxies for different, they can be compared with one another. And we have a reconstruction then of the environmental conditions of paleoclimate. I mean, this is a very sort of basic, sort of in a nutshell sort of explanation for that. And I would suggest that if she's very interested in that, she should contact perhaps a natural scientist who can explain it a lot better than I can.
So there were, in the last discussion, there were several examples of what kind of proxies can be used to gain insight into past climate. Well, now there's a question by Michael Campeggi, and he has a question for Dr. Clare as well regarding the late pre-pottery Neolithic age crisis in northern Mesopotamia. While there appears to be a trend in settlement reorientation during this period, how informative is this, are the specific material culture assemblages from the sites, and to what extent can we use them as indicators to reinforce the idea of climate fluctuations? So do we have sufficient data on small scale that indicate a change in everyday practices during the period, or is the data too scarce?
I'm just reading the question next to me
here.
here.
You can see it as well.
Thank goodness. Yeah, it's I mean, I was on the fence. Okay, I was saying this so-called late PPNA crisis that I'm sort of proposing in this paper. I mean, it's something, of course, that isn't necessarily climate induced. I mean, this is something that needs to be looked at in much more detail. I mean, this is just a sort of work in progress, as it were. Certainly what we would need on the ground is really good proxy, climate proxy data from archives in the Upper Mesopotamian region for the time span of the early Holocene, especially with a focus on sort of the 9th millennium BC. But of course, I think we'll have to wait for that for a little bit. There are bits and pieces there already, and I think we can make a general picture, but I think we need to be more certain, especially with data coming from the Orpha region, where a lot of these T-pillar sites are located. And of course, that is already underway. We have, within the field research group, we have a cooperation. We're working together with the Freie Universität in Berlin, with a team of geographers physical geographers who are supporting us, who are doing their project work there. So I think in the future, we can look forward to very good climate archives and a bit more information regarding the paleo-environment, paleoclimate in the region during the early Holocene. With regard to the archaeology, I think, there's no definite sort of indication that we're seeing an impact of climate change. I mean, as I said, the contemporaneity of it, just because a climate impact, a peak in a curve corresponds to perhaps a change or a settlement focus or the building of monumental structures doesn't necessarily mean that, it's causal. We have to be very careful not to argue in a deterministic way. But of course, this whole, I mean, I have to sort of go into Göbekli Tepe a little bit because, of course, it's a very rewarding site. I mean, it's these wonderful monumental buildings with these magnificent T-pillars. So much work went into these buildings. They were long-lived buildings for over, perhaps even several hundred years, which were constantly rebuilt, were taken care of. And then they added these T-pillars with these wonderful depictions. I mean, this is literally a record of these people at this transition from hunter-gathering literally to farming. And there were traditions that they were trying to preserve, obviously. And I think, as Mayke Wagner just said, why, if you leave home and if you're moving somewhere else, perhaps you take those traditions with you, or the people who are living there anyway were trying to underline these traditions, underline this sort of narrative of where they come from. Perhaps we're seeing sort of myths given on these depictions on the pillars. They're trying to sort of collect these narratives, preserve these narratives, also with preserving their own identity. So a long answer, sorry, but it's not so simple a question.
So there's another question coming up. You can see it in the chat, but I rephrase it for the people who are just listening. So there's the impression that the effect of climate change on civilizations is still somehow a niche issue in archaeology. And do you agree that it's not so much regarded as it should be? And how can we raise awareness to climate change impacts on early societies and share lessons learned? So do you have any idea on this, to these questions?
I mean, we all live in a kind of a bubble, and I know a lot of people who study the impact of climate and environmental change on societies. So it's always a question of perspective. It is interesting, but it's interesting as many other branches in archaeology. And I think it's important, but I mean, we should always keep in mind all the different factors who influence societies, and not to become like climate determinists. If you focus too much on that topic, then you will always see correlations between climate changes and occupation. So it's a very important issue, and everybody should keep it in mind. But you should always keep your eyes and ears open to include as many factors and proxies as you can to explain development in an area at a certain time.
Does someone want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add that I think it's very important to keep this in mind, and maybe it helps to break it down in several components. You see, when we are talking about climate change, it's such a big term. So but what does it really mean? So in which way and what factors, which proxies we are really talking about? Is it humidity? Is it rainfall? So it's the issue of water. It's the issue of plants, wild plants, domesticated plants, or plant cover in general. You know, there's a lot of publications recently, like Kochia's book, Wurzeln der Welt, yeah, so root of the world or something, reminding us that everything is closely related. So human life depends on the life of others, of plants and animals. So we have this, if something changes in this balance, of course it influences, but we not always call it climate change in humans. Yeah, we're calling it maybe vegetation change or something, but it is part of the climate change story. And it helps maybe to get more aware of this problem, to breaking it in smaller steps, in smaller topics and smaller questions, which we then can try to answer one by one, but not always huge and big pictures, because this is difficult to cope with for one scientist, or let's say even for one group.
There's another question. Yeah, sorry.
I think that that's a really good point, and I think that also archaeology is sort of full of examples of these human-environment interactions that went very well and that went very poorly, and that we can provide examples of that, just, you know, show like sort of even in the past, even given sort of the much smaller scale, you know, how we can affect and impact our environments, and that lesson can be used for modern issues.
So there's another question by Sinem Aslan. Is it possible to understand when and in which impact environmental hazards happened in the past by tracking the archaeological findings? So what kind of archaeological findings can be used, maybe rock art, to get a handle on environmental changes?
I mean, I'm just trying to analyze how I do it myself. I mean, I think obviously it's, as we've mentioned already, you know, it's dangerous just to look at the contemporaneity of climate and culture change. And I think, of course, we, as archaeologists, we always see the change, or we see transitions, and we're working, you know, we have our terminology and they're based on certain transitions, you know, PPNA, PPNB, pottery, Neolithic. But I don't think we could actually use those as an indicator for climate change. I think then we still rely very much on the natural scientists, and to actually take each piece of evidence and bring those pieces of evidence together in order to have a picture, an educated picture of what was going on or what could have been going on at that time. So I don't think, unless anyone else from the panel knows how you could use archaeology to track climate change in that way, I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know specifically if it works for climate change, but I'm latching on to environmental hazards at the beginning of the question. And there's certainly groups that work on environmental hazards, extreme events, those sorts of things where you can see, you know, a major catastrophic flood deposit or something where you can see in the stratigraphy that it's, you know, a much larger deposit or a higher energy deposit and that sort of destruction. People certainly do look at that. It's usually less related specifically to climate change than to like sometimes social changes, but it can be climate change.
So one lesson in all of your talks was that there's a very complex interactions between climate, environment, and humans, and it goes both ways. So there's not one take-home message, one story to get out of all the individual sites and the archaeological evidence there. But when the ideas get transported from the field of archaeology to the public sphere, they are getting narrow and easy. So for example, Neolithic Revolution in the public, it seems like a revolutionary event. And when you listen to Clare, it's drawn out over millennia. So are there any simple messages for the public, or should the message be, it's complicated, look at everything, at every single site individually, and we have to deal with climate change in every place on Earth in the local circumstances?
I think that our tendency is to say, well, it's more complicated than that, but that doesn't always get the message across in a concise way to the public, for example. So we do need to be better at that as a discipline, because they do catch on to the sort of sexy terminology that is not necessarily characteristic of every place.
The simple answer is it's complicated.
I think, Clare, you expressed strong views on the term Neolithic Revolution and said it's archaeology.
I think I mentioned that. I mean, you've sort of paraphrased sort of my take-home message, as it were. You know, it's a long period and a lot was going on, and it is complicated. But my biggest worry when we're talking about today and the social media, and, you know, of course, coming from the background of working at a site which is very much in the media, there is a lot of attention given to the site, which, let's say, it's not particularly based on scientific facts, but there's very much interpretation in there. I'm not saying it's wrong or it's bad, but I'm just saying we have to be careful, because, of course, you know, it's these pictures of meteorites coming down, impacting and causing climate change, with sort of villagers looking on. This is a sort of thing that gets the attention of the media and of the modern media user, as it were. And I think we have to work against that in a way. And I think it's down to us to get the message across what, you know, our scientific results are. I mean, it's our responsibility to get that message out there, to let people know, you know, what are our conclusions. And I think this format that we're having here is something that, you know, is a major contribution to that.
So I'll say to the audience, if you still have questions, now is the time to ask them, because if there are no more questions, I would like to ask in a final round, since this ground check discussions are aimed not only on the exchange between archaeologists, but to the general public as well. You already mentioned ideas like the diversity of food is an important issue. What else do you think should people take home from this session in order to make more evidence-based decisions on their own relation with climate change in nowadays?
Yeah, maybe there is no simple answer. Yeah, so be interested in that topic, and then, I mean, try to learn as much as possible. There are so many ways to learn about climate change and what happened in the past and what's going on now, just to be aware of it's a serious issue. Yeah, let's say. So we saw lots of societies coming and going, and sometimes it was connected to climate change, sometimes not. Sometimes climate change just triggered social changes. And so I think some years ago, maybe we thought that we are, I don't know, nothing will really happen to us. And then we have a pandemic, we have serious data about climate change and many other problems we never thought about 10 or 20 years ago. And so we have to take this topic very serious, and everybody has to learn as much as he can about it to be able also to react in a proper way. Yeah. If you don't have any knowledge about, I don't know, pandemics, and then you are not able to take your right decisions, how to behave in such a situation. So this is what Lee also said. Yeah, education is a very important issue, and that can help, even if you're pessimistically, it may help us to overcome the present situations.
And I think it's always worth to look what the people did in the past, which solutions they found under certain circumstances at certain moments of time. So that can make us very optimistic. So I'm staying with the term optimism, because this is something which I think certainly everyone needs today. And as archaeologists can oversee usually several generations of humans and the development in the long run, in the long way. So this is also something which we just simply practice at present. So look and think for generations to come, as we look for generations who gone already, who went already. So this is a quite nice connection and combination. Talk to us how the long view helps in living and in creating, I'd say, cooperation. Cooperation is, I think, the basic point. Talk to us and connect with us in, let's say, comparing developments and keeping varieties, not only variety of nature, but also variety of cultures and different lifestyles, even if they're only short. But there's always something which is worthwhile maybe to revive or to adapt in modern times.
There's now one last question coming up. Esther Scholz says that's very interesting. Thanks. And are there good maps or simulations of the period discussed of coastlines, flood areas, so where the changes became visceral and can be easily seen? So are there resources available in this respect? So Dr. K, your maps, I think there's a paper which can be...
Yeah, the maps that I showed today are published in the Journal of World Prehistory. And I think that depending on sort of what you are looking for in maps, there are several resources available online. Not a whole lot of global things, but, you know, sort of depending on what area you're interested in, then you can find, you know, past reconstructions and map sets for different places, different specific case studies.
And there's still another question for Clare. How would you define the decline of civilizations? The number of sites, the number of archaeological remains, or what do you mean by decline?
Decline of, I wouldn't go as far as calling it the decline of civilization. I think, you know, what I was looking at is more or less a spatial movement, or, you know, an unexplained movement of settlement activity from one area to another. And I really wouldn't call it a decline of a civilization, but I would say that, you know, sure, I mean, at the end of the you know, early PPNB towards middle PPNB, these large special buildings of the type we find it. So, and a colleague here in Turkey would refer to it as the Göbekli Tepe culture. It's not a term that I would agree with, but I mean, this is something that then disappears, and we have, you know, all of this monumental building. We don't have it anymore until much later. And in fact, the ritual sort of sphere, I mean, these buildings were used for ritual as well. It sort of moves into the domestic area, into the house itself. And then later on at sites like Çatalhöyük, we have, you know, sort of ritual areas within the houses in themselves. So this is a development which really starts at Göbekli Tepe, I think, in my opinion. So nothing ends. It's not a collapse or a decline of a civilization. Things obviously continue, but just in a different way.
Okay. So thank you all on the panel and all the people who have asked questions and listened to the discussion. One take-home message for sure is that it's very worthwhile to look at these case studies and look at how people reacted to a different environment and how they impacted on the environment. Because when you look at the scientific stories, they are much more nuanced and much more interesting than the short version you might read in the newspaper. So I encourage you, look for the papers, read them. You will be surprised. It will be interesting. And this is our ground check discussion for today. And I want to invite you for next week's discussion, round 3, water management and desertification. This will be on the 7th of October, another Wednesday, again at 6 p.m. And we will look at the first irrigated gardens. We will look at the problems gardens face today in today's climate change and how local knowledge might be the key to keep the water running. So I hope I'll see you again in a week, and thank you to all of you and have a nice evening. Goodbye.